Concordance of Dust. Prologue. The note reached Professor Benedict Harrow 4 days after Adrian Vale died. It arrived in a blue envelope of the sort stationers no longer bothered to stock, its flap sealed with too much gum and 3 obsolete stamps placed at angles that would have annoyed any ordinary correspondent and immediately unsettled Harrow. The porter at St. John's left it with the Morning Post on a silver tray beside the marmalade, and Harrow, who had spent 40 years teaching generations of mathematicians to mistrust ornament, knew before he slit it open that Adrian had done nothing by accident. Outside, the November court lay under a white film of frost. Chapel stone gave back the first weak light. Somewhere in the stairwell, a scout was singing under his breath. Harrow unfolded the note and read it once standing, then sat down very carefully and read it again. Benedict, there are 18. Proofs, not editions. Known books, some of them mortifyingly famous. I have written only in the margins because printers understand correction better than physicists. The copies are in second-hand shops in countries whose initials follow the alphabet from A to R. Do not trust text alone. Catalogue paper, trim, quiring, damage, prices, repairs, stamps, dust, and latitude. Only in the catalogue does the sequence appear. It is not religion, though it will resemble one. It is not madness, though I know how it sounds. Gather 9 minds, not followers. The universe is corrected from the edges. A.V. There was no greeting beyond his name, no apology, no argument, none of Adrian's old impatience. That, more than anything, made Harrow afraid. Adrian Vale had been his student 15 years earlier, a gaunt young man with an appetite too large for any syllabus, the kind of mind that solved other people's problems before they finished explaining them, and then seemed faintly embarrassed by the fact. He had not become famous. Fame, as Harrow knew, was not a reliable measure of intelligence, only of timing, fluency, luck, and the willingness to become legible to institutions. Adrian had all the wrong gifts. He was brilliant, solitary, and constitutionally unable to pretend certainty when he did not feel it. He drifted from postdoctoral scraps into editorial work, then into the strange shadow economy of scholarship, proofreading, indexing, advising private collectors, restoring old mathematical notebooks for auction houses and libraries. He handled the unfinished versions of books, galleys, page proofs, unbound sheets, the wounded and temporary states through which published thought passed on its way to seeming inevitable. He had also, Harrow knew, been afraid for years. Adrian's father had died at 39 of a cerebral aneurysm. An aunt and an older sister had gone almost as young. Adrian never spoke of it plainly, but his terror of early death clung to him like static. He lived as if time were a grant about to expire. In the last year of his life, he had written Harrow 3 increasingly eccentric letters about printers' marks, cosmological noise, and what he called redundancy deep enough to generate reality. Harrow had answered the first with caution, the second with irritation, and the third not at all. Then Adrian had collapsed at Liverpool Street Station on a damp Tuesday evening, a burst vessel behind the eye, dead before the ambulance reached the hospital. The official language had been clinical and clean, unexpected, sudden, tragic. Harrow folded the note and placed it on the table beside his untouched toast. He sat for a long time, feeling his own pulse in his wrists. By noon, he was in Adrian's rooms in Cambridge, with the landlord's permission and the quiet disgust of a man performing a duty he already knew would change him. The rooms were sparse and meticulous to the point of parody. Books in unstable towers, 2 sharpened pencils set parallel on a desk, a kettle so furred with limescale it seemed geological. On the wall above the desk, Adrian had pinned a strip of paper on which 18 capital letters were written in a neat vertical line. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 1, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R. Nothing else remained of his supposed discovery. No theorem, no manuscript, no draft, only postal receipts in a drawer, 18 of them, to booksellers and shipping offices in Argentina, Belgium, Croatia, Denmark, Egypt, France, Germany, Hungary, India, Japan, Kenya, Laos, Mexico, Norway, Oman, Peru, Qatar, and Romania. Harrow understood 2 things at once. First, Adrian had not been raving. The postal receipts proved design, patience, expenditure, planning. He had done what the note claimed and distributed something precious or perverse or both. Second, if there was any truth in the note, the truth had been hidden not in text, but in provenance, condition, sequence, objecthood, everything scholars neglected when they were in too much of a hurry to read. By evening, Harrow had locked Adrian's note in the inner compartment of his college safe and begun making a list of names. He did not call it a society at first. That would have sounded melodramatic even to him. He thought of it as a temporary working group, then as a private research collaboration, then, once the first recruit accepted and the second asked, with a face gone pale, whether anyone else knew, he stopped naming it at all. Only later, when there were 9 of them and a room of their own and a world map on the wall with 18 pins advancing from A to R, did Gabriel Rook, the bookseller, call them what they plainly were. A concordance, he said, looking at the table where the first grey box lay closed between them like a bomb. Of dust, of error, of obsession, choose the most respectable phrase you can live with. The name remained, and that was how the concordance began. 1. The 9th chair. By the time Mara Ellison entered the old observatory room for the first time, Benedict Harrow had already spent 2 years becoming a man she would once have mistrusted on sight. She knew him by reputation long before she knew him personally. Everyone in Cambridge who lived among old paper knew Harrow. Retired professor, logician of impossible exactitude. A man who had once made a visiting Fields medalist cry during a seminar and later walked the same man back across court in the rain beneath his umbrella. A man whose students tended either to adore him or take years to recover from him. Mara had encountered him only in passing, usually in reading rooms or college dinners, where he carried his age like a challenge rather than an affliction. At 37, Mara was senior cataloguer for modern scientific manuscripts at the university library. Before that, she had been a mathematician. Before that, she had been, briefly and painfully, what people called promising. She had left mathematics for reasons she found tedious to explain. Officially, she said she preferred material history to abstraction. Unofficially, she had watched her younger brother Louis disappear into patterns no one else could see, had sat with him in hospital rooms while he explained with terrible lucidity how television schedules, municipal bus routes, and the spacing of branches on winter trees proved that the world was coded. She had learned how close brilliance and delusion could sometimes lie when fed by grief and sleep loss, and the human need for correspondence. After Louis died, Mara discovered she no longer trusted the part of herself that thrilled too quickly at hidden order. She went to books because books, unlike minds, had bindings. They possessed limits. A page ended where it ended. That was why Harrow wanted her. He summoned her on a Monday in February with a note so brief it seemed insolent. "Come at 8, Old Observatory. Bring your judgment." Mara arrived through wet, dark, and let. Mara arrived through wet, dark, and let herself in with the key Harrow had left at the porter's lodge. Upstairs, in a former instrument room with boarded windows and stripped floorboards, 9 lamps burned around a long oak table. 8 people were already seated. Harrow stood at the head in a charcoal suit that made him look like a clergyman who had misplaced his parish and found himself in charge of a laboratory instead. At his right sat a man in an expensive dark coat with a bookseller's elegant ruin about him, silver at the temples, a cut on one knuckle, shoes that had once been handmade and were now permanently powdered with dust. Gabriel Rook, Mara realized with a small jolt. She knew him by dealer catalogues and whispered stories. Beside him sat a woman in a headscarf, younger than Mara, with clear dark eyes and the careful stillness of a conservator, Noor Halabi. Next, a broad-shouldered, prematurely white-haired man in round glasses who looked like he had been arguing with invisible idiots all afternoon, Anton Radev, the cryptographer. Near the end of the table, Sister Inez Carvalho in a plain grey habit that somehow made her seem more severe, not less. Kenji Sato, all mildness and long fingers and a half-forgotten tie. Helena Strauss, whose papers on background radiation anomalies Mara had read with professional envy. Layla Haddad, paleographer and polyglot, with a scar along one wrist. Rafael Ortega, geodesist, field surveyor, weathered by maps. There was one empty chair. Harrow indicated it. Mara sat. No one made the ordinary noises of a first meeting. No pleasantries, no introductions, only attention, like dry paper waiting for the spark. Harrow placed a blue envelope on the table. Adrian Vale was my student, he said. 2 years ago he sent me this note and then died. I have spent those 2 years confirming that he did in fact mail 18 rare proof copies to second-hand bookshops in 18 countries. We have recovered one. Before we proceed further, Dr. Ellison needs to decide whether we are fools, victims, or in possession of a problem worth our lives. It would have sounded theatrical from anyone else. From Harrow, it sounded like weather. He passed Mara the note. She read it once and felt, beneath her professional skepticism, the cold old stirring she hated in herself. The sudden desire to look up, connect, interpret, yield to pattern. She read it again more slowly. The handwriting was firm and unslanted, not manic, not tremulous. The list of material features, trim, quiring, repairs, dust, struck her hardest. It was exactly what no fantasist would invent unless he had spent his life with real books. Harrow nodded to Gabriel, who opened the grey clamshell box in front of him. Inside lay an unbound page proof of Flatland. The wrappers were gone. The edges had been trimmed by some impatient owner decades earlier. Foxing freckled the lower corners. A bookseller's price in old Argentine pesos, absurdly low, had been penciled faintly on the first leaf. And in the margins, almost too small to see without leaning close, ran dozens of marks in graphite. Combs, loops, ladders, clusters of dots, corrections that corrected nothing in the printed text. Mara lifted the first sheet with gloved fingers. She knew proof copies intimately. They were promises, not books. Unstable, provisional states carrying printers' directions, authorial temper, the ghost of what publication might become. This one was genuine, more than genuine. It bore press marks no forger would bother inventing, fold memory in the gutter, offsetting from interleaving tissue now lost. And the marginalia, she bent closer, did not merely decorate. They were placed in relation to signature marks, line endings, catchwords, crop lines. Whoever had written them understood the page not as a text to be read, but as a coordinate field. "What did you catalogue?" Harrow asked. Mara did not answer immediately. She was looking at the lower edge of sheet D3, where one of Adrian's marks, a tiny graphite bracket no larger than an ant, sat exactly 11 millimeters from the printer's registration point. "Not a commentary," she said at last. "A measurement system." Something changed in the room when she said it. Not relief. Worse. Confirmation. Helena leaned forward. "That was my conclusion." "And mine," said Kenji softly. "Mine was that it looked like a heretical angel script," Sister Inez said, "which is only another way of saying I did not yet know enough mathematics." Gabriel smiled without humor. "I said it looked expensive." The tension broke by a degree. Harrow did not smile, but his shoulders eased. Mara set down the sheet and looked again at the empty spaces around the room. Against the wall stood 18 identical grey archival boxes, only one of them occupied. On a corkboard beside them, a map of the world held a single red pin over Buenos Aires. Below the map, in Harrow's narrow hand, a list of countries ran from A to R. "How did you find it?" Mara asked. Gabriel answered. "A flood-damaged shop in San Telmo, unsold estate stock. It had been misdescribed as an incomplete school geometry text and left in a fruit crate beneath cookbooks." "That will happen," Mara murmured. "It happened because Adrian understood booksellers as well as he understood mathematicians," Gabriel said. "He hid value in places where the wrong people would mistake it for rubbish." Harrow folded his hands. "We meet on the last Monday of every month. We speak of this to no one outside the room. We travel in pairs or threes. We recover only proof copies bearing Vale's hand. We do not speculate publicly. We catalogue before we read. If you leave with nothing." Mara looked down again at the proof of Flatland. She thought of Lewis, of the diagrams he once drew on hospital paper, beautiful and useless. She thought of how violently she distrusted systems that explained everything, and she thought, too, of the unmistakable material sanity of the page before her. A hoax would have been easier to dismiss if it had been less expertly made. She took the pencil Harrow had placed before her and wrote her name in the ledger. That night, when she returned to her flat with rain darkening the river railings and the colleges asleep behind old stone, she knew only two things. The first was that Adrian Vale, dead in his 30s and obscure to almost everyone who had not handled unfinished books, had hidden something extraordinary in the margins of a rare proof. The second was that if it proved to be madness, it would be madness with impeccable line spacing. 2. The alphabet begins. The first year of the Concordance was the year the world became for Mara a series of backrooms. Second-hand shops revealed themselves not as businesses but as climates. Each had its own barometric pressure of neglect and appetite. Some were cathedral shops, orderly and overlit, ruled by bibliographic pride. Some were widow shops where the dead proprietor's habits lingered more powerfully than any current accounting system. Some were graveyard shops where books had gone not to be sold, but to be survived by. Gabriel taught Mara the distinctions quickly, and with a tenderness he hid under sarcasm. "Never trust a shop that smells only of coffee," he told her in Brussels, moving past a display of polished first editions put out for tourists beneath the glass of the Galeries Royales. "Coffee means curation. Curation means performance. We're looking for places where stock has acquired geology." Brussels was the second pin on the map. The trail had run through a carbon copy invoice from an estate liquidator in Antwerp, then through a retired dealer who remembered sending English children's paper unbound to a bookseller whose premises had since shrunk to a narrow side passage lined with postcards and war pamphlets. The proprietor was a woman with silver hair and nicotine fingers who distrusted anyone under 60 and despised everyone equally until Gabriel mentioned, by chance or design, the nickname of her dead husband's mentor in the Paris trade. After that, she led them downstairs without another word. The cellar held cheap novels, maps, devotional prints, rusted filing cabinets, and in the lowest drawer of a cabinet that no longer closed properly, an uncorrected proof of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. The thing looked pathetic. No wrappers, water stain up the rear leaves, one corner nibbled by mice long dead. But Adrian's hand was there, minute grey marks stepping along the outer margin in irregular bands, then clustering at page intervals that made no sense until Mara noticed they corresponded not to chapter breaks, but to the signature letters used by the printer. On the title leaf, almost invisible under old grime, Adrian had written a single dot inside the loop of the decorative A. When the proprietor named her price, Gabriel paid without bargaining. Outside, rain glazed the arcade floor and turned the city to reflected gold. Mara stood under the archway holding the flat parcel against her coat, as if paper could have a pulse. Croatia came 3 weeks later and felt like another world entirely. That trail led through a monastery dispersal, a bookseller in Trieste, an invoice misfiled under theological commentary, and finally a narrow shop in Zagreb run by a widower who kept rare books on kitchen chairs because the shelves had bowed. There, under old mathematics textbooks and a stack of communist-era atlases, Mara and Layla found a proof of Hardy's A Mathematician's Apology, with Adrian's marginalia riding the inner edge like shorebirds. Someone had pressed a fern between two leaves years before. Its ghost remained as a brown fan over half a paragraph. Adrian had written around it without disturbing the shape, incorporating absence into sequence. Layla noticed the first thing no one else had. "It changes hand," she said quietly when they were back in the pensione with the curtains shut. "Not writer, pressure. He uses different pressure ranges at different intervals. He wanted the graphite to age differently." Mara looked up from the collational notes. "Why?" Because he expected separation time damage. Layla touched the margin without quite touching it. He's using degradation as part of the code. That was the first moment Mara understood how far Adrian had gone. He had not simply hidden information in the books. He had hidden it in their future. Denmark, the fourth country, arrived in their hands by courier rather than travel after Raphael and Sister Inez retrieved it from a shop in Norrebro, whose owner, a retired watchmaker, had kept unsold proofs in cigar boxes because he liked the feel of uncut paper. It was Wells, the time machine, and the margins on its later leaves seemed at first sparse enough to disappoint. Only after Kenji digitized the spacing did they discover Adrian had used omission itself as a variable. The blank intervals between signs mattered as much as the signs. By then, the meetings of the Concordance had taken on the gravity of liturgy without surrendering to superstition. On the last Monday of every month, they gathered in the old observatory room. Harrow insisted the first hour be reserved for object description only. Format, collation, chain lines, watermark, damage, provenance, local dust samples sealed in labeled sachets by Noor. No theory until the material facts were fixed. Mara came to love that discipline. It was the opposite of delirium. It was a railing. After the first 3 books, patterns emerged that even she could not shrug aside. Adrian's marks were not random. They formed relational structures consistent across unrelated texts and publishers. More unsettling still, the sequence depended on book-specific features he could not have faked without the objects themselves. Chain line spacing, page trim, replacement sewing, bookseller prices, even the exact shelf depth of the shop in which a copy had rested. Raphael pinned the cities on the map and found that the locations described a distorted but undeniable lattice when projected geodesically. Kenji translated margin positions into graph structures. Anton, with the impatience of a man who felt time personally insulted by difficulty, began building parity matrices on the whiteboard until the room looked as though someone had tried to teach topology to a coven. The marks also looked undeniably occult. On the Alice proof, they rose in the margins like charms. On Flatland, they resembled the plans of impossible chapels. On Hardy, they sat like ritual notches. Mara had spent enough time in archives to know how often advanced notation, separated from context, became visually indistinguishable from magic. But knowing it did not abolish the shiver. Sister Inez watched her one evening as she stared at a blown-up photograph of Adrian's marks on the Brussels Alice. "The difference between a sigil and a notation," Inez said, "is history." Mara glanced at her. "That sounds like something you've been waiting years to say." "It is something history says to us repeatedly," Inez replied. "Most occult diagrams are technologies that lost their manuals." There was no smile on her face when she said it. That made it harder to dismiss. At the end of that first year, they had 4 books in boxes and 4 pins on the map, and Mara had begun to understand the real violence of Adrian's idea. He had hidden a theorem in objects designed to survive incompletely, and the theorem, whatever it was, appeared to require not genius but painstaking communal attention to error. 3. The languages of dust. Egypt changed the scale of the search. Until Cairo, the Concordance had still been operating with the secret vanity of people who suspect they are cleverer than the problem. They had found 4 books. They had a sequence. They had discipline. Cairo reminded them that books crossed history the way bodies crossed weather. Underpowered, vulnerable, subject to accident, theft, mildew, war, inheritance, rats, vanity, and state collapse. The lead took them to the Azbekaya market through 3 dead dealers and 1 living liar. The shop itself was less a shop than a breach in a wall stacked floor to ceiling with paper the color of old teeth. Layla had the language. Gabriel had the nerve. Mara had the inventory slips Adrian had left behind, which matched nothing quite, and therefore, perversely, matched everything. Sand had worked itself into every hinge and board in the place. A fan turned lazily overhead, pushing heat without lessening it. They found the proof in a crate beneath Victorian travel narratives and cheap medical textbooks in French. It was a battered early proof of the golden bough, absurdly fitting and therefore initially suspicious to Mara, until Noor examined the sheets under raking light that night and found 19th-century correction slashes beneath Adrian's graphite. The proof was real. Adrian's hand had threaded its margins with circles, branching stems, and little barred lozenges that looked so much like talismanic forms that even Helena, who had no patience for anything that smelled of enchantment, fell silent when the images were pinned up. It was Inez who dispelled the mood with her usual clean cruelty. "Of course it resembles ritual notation," she said. Ritual notation was one of the only ways pre-modern people represented multi-stage processes in 2 dimensions. Anton glanced up from his computer. "You say that like it helps." "It does help," Inez said. "It means we should stop flattering ourselves with mystery and do better history." France, the 6th country, gave them Einstein and their first serious fright. The trail led not to Paris, but Lyon, to a riverside cellar shop run by a former physics teacher who had spent 20 years buying job lots from British dealers, too lazy to sort scientific material. He remembered the proof because he had mistaken it for a classroom copy and nearly lent it out. It was a fragile pamphlet state of relativity, the special and the general theory, unassuming to the point of invisibility, the paper browned and brittle at the folds. Adrian's marks here were spare and severe, short graphite bars positioned at intervals from the text block, so precise that Mara measured them 3 times before trusting her own ruler. Nor examined the margins under magnification in Cambridge and discovered that Adrian had not used 1 pencil but 6, switching hardness according to a sequence of primes. The softer graphite had sunk more deeply into paper fibers. The harder had aged paler. He had coded not only shape and position, but future contrast. "Who thinks like this?" Kenji murmured when she showed them. "A proofreader who expects not to be alive when the proof is read," Mara said. That was the first evening Harrow spoke at length about Adrian's fear. They had finished the formal cataloguing. 6 grey boxes sat on the table, each labelled only with a letter and country. Outside, rain brushed the boarded windows. Harrow stood by the map with one hand braced on the back of his chair, and for the first time Mara saw how much age had entered him in the years since his retirement, the stiffness in the shoulder, the slight tremor that appeared when he thought himself unobserved. "Adrian believed," he said, "that he would die before anyone listened to him. He had reason. His father died at 39, his sister at 36. He underwent scans every year and trusted none of them. He once told me that the most rational decision he ever made was to stop buying long furniture." No one spoke. "He hid his work in proofs because proofs are made to survive correction," Harrow continued, "because they are unfinished, and unfinished things are often overlooked, because the margins are structurally privileged in printing but intellectually ignored by readers, and I suspect because he found the metaphor irresistible. If physical law was, as he believed, a correction system, then there was a savage elegance in proving it through printers' errors." Helena had been skeptical from the beginning in the exact way Mara admired. Not hostile to wonder, only disciplined against it. She now tapped the table lightly with one knuckle. "Elegant doesn't make it true." "No," Harrow said. "That is why we are here." But it was beginning, despite Helena, despite Mara, to look dangerously like truth. With 6 books, Anton's matrices ceased to behave like clever play. They began to lock together. The transformations he derived from the margin positions and material features generated a family of error-correcting structures much richer than any simple steganographic game required. Kenji overlaid them on the geodesic positions of the 6 cities and obtained a tensor network whose symmetries Helena recognized with visible reluctance from theoretical models of emergent space-time. "It's ugly," Anton said, peering at the screen. "Good," Helena answered. "Nature usually is." What frightened Mara most was not the mathematics, it was the recurrence of care. Adrian had anticipated loss, abrasion, trimming, mold, incompetent rebinding, the vanity of booksellers, the provincial habits of cataloguers. He had hidden his sequence where damage would preserve it. That was not how madmen thought. That was how conservators thought, how editors thought, how people who loved objects enough to imagine their afterlives thought. When Mara returned home after the Lion meeting, she dreamed of Louis for the first time in months. In the dream, he was not ill. He was sitting at the kitchen table of their childhood home, turning a library book over in his hands and saying with perfect calm, "You were wrong about the margins. That's where the real argument goes." She woke before dawn with the old familiar shame in her throat, the fear that she had joined an exquisite version of the thing that had destroyed him. The next week, Germany and Hungary gave her no time to retreat. 4. Fire in Budapest. Germany should have been easy. Leipzig had once been a city of printers. That alone made it suspiciously apt. The lead ran through a dealer in scientific remainders, then a deceased professor's estate, then into a narrow shop in a former East German administrative building where everything smelled faintly of dust, radiators, and old tobacco. Gabriel and Helena went first. Mara joined them a day later after a train delay and found the proof already laid out on a green baize table under poor light. Freud, of all things, an early proof of the interpretation of dreams, its first leaves foxed, the back wrapper missing, the margins restless with Adrian's compressed notation. Helena looked offended by its existence, as if Adrian had committed a methodological sin by choosing a text that attracted the wrong kinds of undergraduates. "Maybe he had a sense of humor," Gabriel said. "Or malice," Helena replied. A clumsy rebinding in the 1950s. Adrian, a clumsy rebinding in the 1950s. Adrian had anticipated that too. He had placed redundant elements elsewhere on the sheet so that loss in the inner margin did not destroy the transform. Mara felt a bleak admiration. He had built resilience into paper the way engineers built it into bridges. From Leipzig, they went to Budapest because a warehouse there was due to be cleared after the death of a dealer who had bought British stock indiscriminately for 40 years. Harrow disliked haste, but the Hungarian lead smelled too much like imminence. Gabriel, Anton, and Mara arrived under a low sky and walked straight into catastrophe. The fire had started in the adjacent unit before dawn. By the time they reached the warehouse district, the blaze had been contained, but the row of corrugated buildings still sweated heat and black water. Fire crews were coiling hoses through slush and ash. The dealer's nephew, soot-faced and furious, waved them away until Gabriel produced a card, a name, and a sum of cash with the kind of speed that suggested old habits more than civic virtue. 15 minutes later, they were inside in masks, stepping over burst boxes and shelves collapsed into cinders. There are few smells more desolate than burnt paper. It is sweet and terminal and unlike wood because of the ink. Anton found the proof. It lay inside a steel plan chest that had buckled but not fully burned, under account books and maps charred at the edges. He gave a sharp sound Mara had never heard from him before, not quite a shout, and by the time she reached him, he was on one knee in black water, holding a damp packet against his chest. His right glove had burned through. The proof, once they got it outside, proved to be an uncorrected English proof of Borges's labyrinths, blistered at the corners, warped but alive. Adrian's graphite, astonishingly, had survived better than some of the printed text. On the flyleaf, a triangular bookseller's stamp had half burned away. Noor later identified the soot pattern as useful, because of course she did. The heat differential across the paper recorded where interleaving had once sat, which in turn preserved one of Adrian's omitted intervals. That night in the hotel, Anton sat with his bandaged hand on the table and refused painkillers out of sheer temper. Mara catalogued by lamplight while Gabriel telephoned Harrow in Cambridge and spoke in the low, dry voice he reserved for the old man, all irony stripped from it. Helena, back in Germany, ran comparative transforms from digital scans already sent. At 3 in the morning, Kenji called. His face appeared on the laptop screen, grainy with bad hotel bandwidth, eyes bright with fatigue. Behind him in the observatory room, the whiteboard was covered edge to edge. "The first 8 lock," he said without greeting. "Not perfectly, but enough. Anton was right about the parity structure. Helena was right about the geometry. We think—" He broke off, as if the word itself offended him. Helena, now also on the call from Leipzig, said it for him. "It maps onto a known family of quantum error-correcting codes proposed in holographic space-time models." Anton looked up, all his exhaustion gone hard and hungry. "Known? Known in outline," Helena said. "Not like this. Not with this much constraint." Mara understood perhaps a third of the mathematics in its details and all of it in its implication. If Adrian's sequence genuinely instantiated a sophisticated error-correcting structure comparable to those used by physicists to model emergent space, then the claim in his note that the universe was corrected from the edges stopped sounding metaphorical. Could he have built it as a hoax from existing theory? She asked. Helena did not answer immediately. That frightened Mara more than any immediate certainty would have. "Not with the timestamps," Helena said at last. "Not if the first books were mailed when Harrow says they were. He'd have needed ideas that hadn't entered the literature yet, or at least not in forms available to him." The call ended near dawn. Budapest outside the hotel windows was damp and grey and full of ordinary commuters who had no reason to imagine that in a room above the street, 3 exhausted scholars were contemplating the possibility that a dead proofreader had hidden a cosmological proof inside rescued literary wreckage. Later, back in Cambridge, Helena did what made Mara trust her more than anyone except perhaps Noor. She tried to kill the theory. She returned to raw data sets from old cosmic background measurements, looking not for confirmation but for mismatch. Adrian's code, translated through Anton's matrices, implied a particular suppression pattern in a narrow harmonic band, tiny, almost embarrassingly tiny, the sort of effect most scientists sensibly blamed on noise or calibration unless forced otherwise. Helena checked 3 archives. 2 were inconclusive. The third, from a detector whose calibration quirks were notorious and therefore well documented, showed exactly the suppression Adrian's transform predicted. She printed the graph and laid it on the table at the next meeting. No one spoke for several seconds. It was not proof, not yet. It was worse. It was evidence. The room seemed suddenly older than brick and plaster, older than the observatory itself. The 8 recovered books sat in their cases along the wall like a row of sleeping instruments. Harrow did not look triumphant. He looked tired unto the bone. "We continue," he said. No one argued. That night, Mara walked alone through Cambridge in the cold, past lit staircases and bicycles slick with rain, and felt the world tilt a fraction beneath ordinary appearances. The fear that had driven her out of mathematics returned, but changed. She was no longer afraid merely of seeing patterns where none existed. She was afraid some patterns, once seen, could not be put back into the dark. 5. Monsoon arithmetic. India was where the Concordance became a family, though none of them would have used the word at the time. Families, Mara knew, came with debt and repetition and ways of wounding one another so intimate they felt hereditary. What formed among the 9 of them was different. Less forgiving, perhaps, but chosen, and therefore in some ways more dangerous. They learned one another's silences. They learned who failed when hungry, who became reckless when contradicted, who needed sleep before data, who grew gentler under stress rather than sharper. They learned that obsession, if shared carefully enough, could imitate trust. The Indian proof lay in Shimla, in a hill station shop whose roof drummed all afternoon under monsoon rain. It had arrived there years earlier in a lot of unsorted English-language stock bought from a Delhi wholesaler who barely remembered the transaction, and only then because Gabriel, with infuriating ease, remembered the wholesaler's brother from a fair in Frankfurt 10 years before. The shop itself sold textbooks, prayer calendars, detective novels, guidebooks, and any number of once expensive works of scholarship now furred with damp. The proprietor kept the best things in biscuit tins to protect them from insects. When he opened the tin for Mara and Noor, the proof inside was so immediately recognizable that Mara laughed despite herself. A Brief History of Time. Popular, mortifyingly famous, exactly as Adrian had promised. The proof was a pre-publication state, heavily corrected by someone at the press before Adrian ever touched it. He had added only a sparse set of notations in the outer margins and one small, hooked line beneath a figure caption. Yet the copy contained features no other recovered book had carried: a recent bookseller's price in rupees, 2 tide lines from humidity exposure, and a thread repair in red cotton across the rear wrapper that Noor later identified as local and therefore temporarily informative. Adrian had chosen the world's better-known books with a kind of wickedness. He knew that once their proof states lost wrappers or accrued damage, they could masquerade as classroom cast-offs or partial reading copies, rarity dressed as banality. The rain trapped Mara and Noor in Shimla an extra day. They sat in a boarding-house dining room that smelled of cardamom and wet wool while the town dissolved into cloud outside. The proof lay boxed between them, and for the first time since joining the Concordance, Mara found herself telling someone the thing she had never told the others. About Lewis. About hospitals. About what happened when a bright mind, under enough grief and deprivation, became unable to distinguish pattern from command. Noor listened the way good conservators handled damaged paper, without haste, without unnecessary pressure, letting the fibers decide how much they could bear. "When I first saw Adrian's marks," Mara said, staring at the rain on the window, "I thought, I have made a terrible mistake. I have walked willingly back into the machinery that killed my brother." Noor folded her hands around her tea. "And now?" "Now I think the difference may be that this resists us. Lewis only ever found patterns that flattered him. Adrian's work does the opposite. It keeps forcing us back to material fact." Noor nodded. "Delusion hates collation." Mara laughed unexpectedly. It hurt in the chest and then eased something. "Japan sharpened the work again." Jimbocho, Tokyo's book district, felt to Gabriel like paradise and to Mara like a test of stamina. The trail there had nearly gone cold because the relevant shop had changed ownership twice and half the old records had been discarded during a renovation. Kenji came alive in that district in a way Mara had not seen before, moving with uncanny certainty through alleys of paper, talking to elderly shopkeepers in a voice gentler than the one he used in meetings, noticing shelving systems, old labels, the habitual geometry of rooms. The proof they sought, Gödel, Escher, Bach, because Adrian's sense of irony had never slept, was not in the locked cabinet where the current proprietor kept valuable stock. It was exactly where Adrian would have trusted it to vanish, on a top shelf in the workroom, filed among damaged English-language books on computing because a former assistant had mistaken it for a defective review copy. The marginalia here were densest of all, but not on the expected pages. Adrian had concentrated them at positions corresponding to plate sections and page blanks, using the architecture of a complex modern book as if it were a circuit board. Kenji found something else too, not in the proof, but in the room. He measured the shelf intervals while the proprietor fetched a ladder. He checked the spacing between the back work table and the wall, then smiled a thin, alarming smile and asked for the old floor plan if one existed. By evening he had shown, to the irritation of everyone but Raphael, that the internal dimensions of the shops themselves were recoverable through plans, photographs, or shelving scars, contributed another layer to Adrian's transform. "He hid variables in storage habits," Anton said in disbelief. "In constraints," Kenji corrected. "He chose shops with certain room ratios." Raphael, who understood how coordinates became systems and how systems became the invisible skeletons of the world, began replotting the recovered cities with new weightings. The lattice on the wall acquired depth. It was no longer merely a sequence of places, it was an object in space. Kenya gave them biology. The Nairobi shop had once been attached to a railway clerk's office and still smelled of oil, paper, and warm metal. Its owner had bought a mixed lot from a British missionary school 30 years before and forgotten most of it. There, among outdated chemistry texts and agricultural manuals, Layla and Noor found an early proof of the double helix. Adrian's marks rode the margins in paired curls and interruptions that Anton immediately, obscenely described as genetically smug. Yet the real clue came from the paper dust trapped under the back wrapper. Noor identified traces of red earth, fungal spores, and a preservative used in East African storage facilities in the 1980s. Another time layer, another way of anchoring provenance to transformation. At the meeting after Kenya, with 11 grey boxes now filled and the map beginning to look less like a scholar's scheme than a campaign, Raphael pinned a transparent overlay over the world and stepped back. The shops, taken in order, formed a geodesic object so elegant Mara swore under her breath. Not a circle, not a star, something stranger, a laddered polytope projected badly onto the globe, a structure whose vertices advanced alphabetically and also optimized distance, redundancy, and angular relation. Adrian had not chosen Argentina after Belgium after Croatia, merely because the letters pleased him. He had found a way to make the alphabet behave like geometry. "And the geometry," Helena said quietly, studying the overlay, "behaves like a correction network." She looked at Harrow. For once, the old man did not try to hide his dread. It was becoming less and less plausible that Adrian had discovered a metaphor. 6. Water, salt, and snow. Laos nearly lost them a book to mold. The shop in Luang Prabang stood 3 doors down from a travel agency and 1 door up from the river level that every old-timer in town measured seasons by. It was attached to a family house and half-run as storage, which meant the stock had entered the phase Gabriel called private geology, accreting in layers no commercial logic had touched for years. The proof they sought had been wrapped in newspaper inside a tin trunk under a shelf of French colonial memoirs. It was Sagan, Cosmos, its pages lightly furred at the edge with bloom. Noor's face when she saw the mold made everyone else step back on instinct. She stabilized the packet on the spot with the calm authority of a surgeon and spent the next 36 hours in an improvised clean corner of their guest house arresting damage with fans, silica, alcohol, and a level of intimate patience that made Mara, watching, understand yet again why Harrow had chosen specific minds rather than famous names. The Concordance did not work because its members were merely brilliant. It worked because they knew how to proceed when matter failed gracefully or failed all at once. Mexico City returned them to argument. The proof there, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, another choice Adrian seemed to have made with a grim little grin, sat in a labyrinthine store off Donceles, where floors dipped, electric wires nested openly overhead, and history survived mainly because no one had yet managed to replace it with anything more profitable. Gabriel handled the owner. Layla handled the catalogue cards. Mara handled the book. Kuhn's proof was rich in ordinary corrections from author and press, which at first made Adrian's editions difficult to isolate. But once isolated, they revealed a new layer, his marks sometimes aligned not with what the book said, but with where later owners had repaired it. A strip of Mexican binding cloth across a cracked hinge, a replacement end paper, a penciled stock number in a hand 40 years younger than the book. All of it entered the sequence. Adrian had hidden his proof not only in the object, but in the object's future encounters with care. "He expected stewardship," Mara said that night, half to herself. "No." Gabriel, stretched in the cracked leather chair of their hotel room, glanced over. "Or dependency." She looked up. "The same thing on a bad day," he said. By Norway, winter had arrived. Bergen held the 13th book, and with it something Mara had not expected: rest. Snow flattened the city to silence. The shop stood on a side street above the harbour, windows fogged from within, its rare stock half shelved and half stacked in disciplined drifts. The proprietor, a widower with the grave courtesy of the very literate, served coffee in thick white cups and asked no needless questions once Gabriel gave the correct name of the London dealer from whom the lot had been bought decades earlier. The proof was the name of the rose, a newer text than the others, and one that made Gabriel mutter darkly about Adrian's insufferable thematic consistency. Its margins carried fewer signs than almost any recovered volume, but the book mattered for other reasons: shelf location, acquisition date, and a bookseller's notation describing it as defective review pages, no wrappers, not worth listing individually. Adrian had relied again on the economies of contempt. They had a free evening in Bergen because the ferries were delayed, and there was, for once, nothing more to do until morning. Gabriel took Mara walking under sodium streetlights along the wharf. Snow made the whole harbour look staged. He did not flirt. That was one of the reasons Mara trusted him. Men who lived by selling rare things often learned to perform intimacy as expertly as they performed knowledge. Gabriel, for all his polish, never once treated her curiosity as a weakness, or her skepticism as a challenge meant to end in bed. He told her instead about the forgery that had nearly ended his career. Years before, early in the trade and too eager to be admitted fully into its higher circles, he had brokered a celebrated atlas that later proved doctored. Not entirely false, that would have been easier, but altered just enough to increase rarity, price, prestige. A scholar built an argument on it. A museum spent heavily on it. When the fraud surfaced, the scholar's reputation collapsed with the object. Gabriel had not forged it. He had simply wanted too badly to believe in the copy. "Since then," he said, looking over the dark water, "I've had a superstition. Whenever something seems designed precisely for my appetite, I assume I am about to be punished." "And Adrian's books?" "They are exactly designed for my appetite," Gabriel said, "which is why I keep waiting for the punishment." Mara tucked her gloved hands deeper into her coat pockets. "Maybe the punishment is just work." He laughed, and in the cold sound there was gratitude. At the next meeting, Harrow stood before the 13 filled boxes and said something Mara would remember years later, long after the revelation itself had settled into the structure of her life. "Adrian chose books that knew they were about worlds," he said. "Labyrinths, time, consciousness, code, creation, error, commentary. He wanted the texts to be widely legible and the objects nearly invisible. He hid cosmology in books that had already trained the public imagination to suspect that reality was stranger than its surfaces." Anton, restless for months now, leaned back with visible impatience. Or he liked symbolism. "He liked redundancy," Harrow said. Anton had been sleeping less. Mara could see it in the thin glaze of his attention, in the speed with which he moved from result to implication without dwelling in doubt. He wanted completeness the way some people wanted absolution. After Norway, he began requesting access to the digitized archive outside meeting hours, which Harrow denied. He began hinting that their secrecy was becoming its own pathology. Helena batted him away in public. Kenji avoided the subject. Mara noticed Gabriel watching Anton the way dealers watched eager bidders at the edge of ruin. The first leak came 2 weeks later, not enough to destroy them, barely enough to name. A query from a private research institute in Geneva to Helena, asking whether she knew of recent work connecting exotic error-correcting codes to historical marginalia. The wording was too strange to be coincidence, and too guarded to be direct. Helena brought the email printed out, laid it on the table, and everyone in the room understood that somewhere, beyond the boarded windows and the last Monday ritual, another appetite had scented the trail. Anton denied nothing outright. That was almost worse. 7. Sand, altitude, glass. Omen proved Adrian had planned for pursuit. The shop lay in the old quarter of Muscat, though shop gave too commercial a feeling to what was in fact a family archive with a sales counter. The relevant lot had come in through a British estate in the late 1990s, been partially sold, partially inherited, partially forgotten. Layla's Arabic and Gabriel's trade credentials got them inside. The proof itself, when at last it emerged from a cabinet above rolled maps and shipping manifests, was a thin paper state of Turing essays gathered under a marketable title years after their first life in journals. Adrian's choice here was the least literary and the most nakedly strategic. Uncomputable numbers had entered the public myth of thinking machines without ever becoming harmlessly familiar. The margins carried very few marks, but the cabinet ledger, the storage dimensions, and the customs entry numbers yielded another rich seam of variables. Then they found the copy of Adrian's own shipping receipt, not the postal stub, those Harrow already had, but a carbon duplicate kept by the family because the parcel had been insured oddly high for material described only as defective English proofs. The sender's signature was not Adrian Vale. It was a false name. So were 3 others in the same ledger, tied to different countries in the sequence. Adrian had anticipated the need to hide the network not only from scholars, but from records that could be subpoenaed, bought, or inherited by the wrong people. Which means, Mara said on the hotel balcony that night, wind lifting the edge of her notes, he expected someone other than Harrow to understand what he'd found. Gabriel's expression gave nothing away. Or he expected institutions to do what institutions do whenever anything smells useful. Is there a difference? Not in practice. Peru nearly killed Raphael. The trail went to Arequipa first, then further inland to a former seminary library half dispersed after an earthquake and a lawsuit. The proof they sought had been sold off informally to a shopkeeper in Cusco who specialized in English-language books bought by travelers and left behind by missionaries. Altitude turned everyone stupid by degrees. Mara's thoughts felt padded. Kenji developed a headache so severe he could barely focus. Raphael, who had spent years surveying difficult terrain, insisted he was fine until the path behind the shop gave way under a rain-softened edge, and he went sliding 6 feet down a stony incline, taking the breath and most of the color out of the group in one instant. He broke 2 ribs and cursed in Spanish with a precision Mara admired, even while helping drag him back up. The proof turned out to be a strange one, less famous than the others, a once-celebrated book on consciousness now read mostly by historians of science and unfashionable philosophers. Adrian's marginalia on it were almost playful, small paired lines, interrupted arcs, a sequence of dots that became legible only when Noor overlaid them on the pattern of water damage from the shop's leaking roof. Again, the object's injuries had become variables. Raphael, bruised and furious in the hotel room, laughed when Mara apologized for making him carry nothing back to Cambridge. "I mapped disaster zones," he said. "If a dead Englishman's theorem wants 2 ribs, it's being polite." They returned with 15 books and fatigue settling into everyone's bones. Qatar was the 17th country and the point at which secrecy failed in earnest. By then, Doha had transformed much of its old commercial heart into a theater of polished surfaces. The original second-hand shop Adrian had used no longer existed. In its place stood a glass-fronted development with curated heritage on the ground floor and money all the way up. Gabriel called it the natural enemy of dust. The trail survived only through shipping manifests, a retired municipal clerk, and a storage company that had absorbed unsold inventory from several demolished premises. When the Concordance arrived, they were not the first to ask. The Morrow Institute, Geneva by registration, money from darker places, had sent a representative with letters, permissions, and the bland confidence of men accustomed to purchasing their way into archives. He was young, neat, almost offensively mild. He introduced himself to Gabriel in a storage corridor as if they were colleagues meeting at a fair. Mara knew immediately from the way Anton's face closed and failed to close that the leak had come from him. The storage facility was refrigerated to preserve paper, and the cold made Fury feel even cleaner. They worked anyway. There was no time for moral drama while the 17th proof still lay somewhere in anonymous cartons. It was Helena who found the critical discrepancy. Morrow's team were searching by title and presumed value. Adrian had once again hidden worth inside contempt. The proof, a battered partial state of Principia Mathematica of all impossible grandiose things, had been logged decades earlier as mathematics pages, incomplete, review waste, because title leaf and wrappers were missing. It sat in a carton of low-value academic cast-offs, 3 aisles from where the Institute's people were looking. Gabriel lifted it out with something like tenderness. The margins were there. So was Adrian's hand, reduced almost to hairlines. So, too, was a penciled storage number added in Doha years after the parcel arrived, a number that Anton, white-faced now, immediately recognized as mathematically meaningful in the next layer of the transform. Morrow's representative was still smiling when Gabriel walked past him with the sealed box under his arm. No one raised their voice until they were back in Cambridge. The observatory room seemed smaller, with 17 boxes filled. Harrow sat rather than stood at the head of the table, a concession to age no one remarked upon. Anton did not attempt a detailed lie. He spoke of responsibility, open science, the danger of private guardianship, the obscenity of sitting on a discovery of civilizational scale because one feared institutions. Some of what he said was true. That made him harder to condemn. "I sent them fragments," he said finally, "only enough to gauge whether they already knew something. I did not give them the archive." Helena's stare could have blistered paint. Gabriel looked bored in the way men do when they are actually deciding whether to forgive or break someone. Mara felt not outrage, but a species of exhaustion. Betrayal had always been the most predictable variable in the room. The surprise was that it had taken this long. Harrow listened without interrupting. When Anton finished, the old man rested both hands on the table, and Mara saw the tremor in them clearly for the first time. "A discovery," Harrow said, "can be true and still arrive as a catastrophe." Anton opened his mouth. Harrow lifted one hand. The gesture was small. It ended the matter more thoroughly than shouting would have. "You are not wrong that this cannot belong to us as property," Harrow said. "You are wrong if you think the first institutions to weaponize it will be the ones most fit to interpret it. You are wrong if you believe speed is the same as courage. And you are catastrophically wrong if you think Adrian hid this in second-hand shops because he trusted power." No one moved. "You will keep working," Harrow said to Anton, "because we need you, and because punishment is a vanity under these conditions. But you will not communicate one syllable beyond this room again without unanimity." Anton looked for one raw instant like a child being told that intelligence could not excuse him. He nodded once. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. They assigned Romanian leads. They collated the Qatari proof. They spoke in clipped voices because there was work and only one country left. By the time the last notes were filed, Harrow's face had gone ashen under the lamps. He rose too quickly, caught the edge of the table, and folded. The ambulance came with appalling ordinary speed. "Age," the doctor later said. "Stress. A heart that had tolerated less than its owner demanded. Not fatal, not yet, but a warning in the language bodies reserved for men who believed themselves useful past their physical limits." On the table, beneath the glaring lights, the 17th grey box remained open. No one said aloud what its emptiness beside the unopened 18th told them. 8. Romania. Harrow survived long enough to send Mara to Romania. He was in Addenbrooke's when she saw him next, diminished not by sentiment but by medical architecture. Rails, monitor wires, the hateful cleanliness of hospital light. Yet his eyes remained exactly themselves. When she arrived with Gabriel and Helena after the morning ward round, he dismissed their concern with a glance and asked first about the Romanian lead. That, more than anything else, persuaded Mara he was truly frightened. He handed her a key on a thin cord and an envelope sealed with red wax, so old-fashioned it would have felt melodramatic from anyone else. On the envelope he had written only, "For after R." "Go," he said. Mara wanted absurdly to ask whether he believed Adrian, not in the mathematics, in the final claim, the one the rest of them still spoke around rather than through, simulation, code, makers, correction. Perhaps Harrow saw the question forming. What we call a thing, he said, voice roughened by exhaustion, depends too much on what we fear. It was the last substantial thing he ever said to her. Romania lay under snow. The trail ended in Iasi by way of Bucharest, a dealer's widow, a university storeroom, and a rumor about English proofs bought cheaply from a British engineer who had died without heirs. The shop itself occupied the ground floor of an old print works, with cracked high windows and cats sleeping on radiator pipes. Its owner, a man with nicotine-yellowed hair and the grave patience of someone accustomed to handling the possessions of the dead, remembered the parcel only because it had contained pages of a book he had once tried and failed to read in French translation. He led Mara and Gabriel into a back room where unsorted stock stood in leaning walls. The proof was exactly where Adrian would have wanted it, between tax manuals and a stack of glossy art catalogues too damaged to sell. It was Nabokov's Pale Fire. Gabriel actually laughed when he saw the title. Not amusement, recognition, horror, respect. A book about commentary overwhelming text, about scholarship as possession, about hidden structures in apparent digression. Adrian had either possessed a monstrous sense of humor or had reached the point where even irony became engineering. The proof looked at first wrong. There were almost no marks in the margins. After 17 recoveries, Mara had come to trust her own first visual impression. This time she distrusted it instantly. Adrian had not spent years building a distributed theorem only to place the last parity in an almost blank copy. She laid the pages out under light and made herself stop wanting significance. She catalogued instead. Paper quality, gatherings, water damage, trim, pencil prices, old and new, a replaced staple, one wormhole passing through 6 leaves at a consistent angle, a shop notation in Romanian on the rear wrapper, thread repair at the lower spine, a faint thumbprint in graphite near the note field, and on the verso of the rear sheet, almost swallowed by age and handling, a single line in Adrian's hand. Do not ask what it says until you have asked what it is. Mara sat back slowly. Gabriel saw it in her face before she spoke. What? She looked around the room at the tottering walls of paper, at the snow-lit window, at the absurd, humble place where Adrian had chosen to end his sequence. He was warning us, she said, all along. Gabriel read the line and went very still. The 18th proof mattered not because of what Adrian had written in it, but because of what it embodied. Damage, repair, routing, survival, objecthood at its most stubborn. The final book was almost blank because Adrian needed the Concordance to learn, in the hardest possible way, that the marginalia were never the whole message. The catalogue, the full, patient, physical description of all 18 objects in sequence, was the message. Text had always been only one channel among many, and not the most important. In the hotel that night, Mara spread photocopies and notes across the bed and saw, with the ugly exhilaration of someone nearing proof, that the nearly blank pale fire supplied not semantic content, but weights. Wormholes as vectors, repair thread as temporal anchor, price notations as ordering checks. The 18th book completed the sequence by forcing the cataloguer to become part of the computation. Human judgment under constraint, not arbitrary. Necessary. She slept badly and woke before dawn to a message from Cambridge. Harrow had died during the night. For several minutes, she could not feel anything except the practical cruelty of timing. Gabriel knocked at her door before she answered, already dressed. Grief concealed the way men in certain trades learn to conceal expensive objects. In plain view, handled lightly, never named unless required. They flew back with the Romanian proof boxed and strapped in the seat between them like an invalid. At the observatory that evening, Harrow's chair stood empty under the lamps. The other 8 members were already there. No one had touched the grey box reserved for R. Mara laid the Romanian proof on the table, placed Harrow's sealed envelope beside it, and felt the room narrow toward decision. 17 recoveries had led to this. 18 books, 9 mines, years of flights, trains, flood basements, warehouse soot, hotel light, catalogues and lies and second-hand faith. Outside, Cambridge continued its winter habits, untroubled by the death of an old mathematician and the arrival of a nearly blank proof from Ayasi. Inside, the Concordance was finally ready to learn what exactly Adrian Vale had trusted them to find. 9. The last catalogue. They did not open Harrow's envelope first. That was Mara's decision, and because grief had made everyone briefly willing to accept authority from wherever it could be found, no one challenged her. If Adrian had spent years forcing them away from the glamour of revelation and back toward labor, then labor would precede any valedictory wisdom Harrow had left behind. For 3 days, the observatory room became what it had always secretly wanted to be: a workshop. The 18 proofs came out of their boxes one by one and took the table in sequence from Argentina to Romania. Mara assigned each a full object record at last. Not the provisional descriptions they had used while the hunt continued, but exhaustive entries of the kind libraries only pretended to value until a catastrophe proved otherwise. She described chain lines, choir signatures, wrapper states, graphite densities, repair materials, ownership marks, shelf depths, acquisition histories, custom house notations, fungal traces, insect damage, rebinding evidence, local price annotations, storage temperatures when known, distances from floor in each shop, even the angle of the Romanian wormhole relative to page edge. Noor and Layla checked every description. Gabriel reconstructed trade routes from memory and notebooks. Raphael fixed coordinates and room ratios. Kenji and Anton built the computational scaffold around the metadata as it came in. Helena, who had spent years mistrusting speculative physics for its lack of discipline, watched in hard silence as bibliographical exactitude turned into a machine. At some point on the second night, Mara understood that exhaustion had ceased to matter. They were past fatigue and into vocation. Books were the safest hiding place Adrian knew because most people believed books were about their words. He had hidden his proof in everything else, in paper sourced from a certain mill and later trimmed by a certain binder, in prices written by bored clerks in different currencies, in the fungal bloom of a Mekong shop and the soot line of a Budapest fire, in shelf ratios in Tokyo, customs numbers in Muscat, thread repairs in Shimla, a worm's path through Romanian paper. Every act of neglect and care had become part of the sequence. The code was not behind the books. It was distributed through their lives as objects. Shortly after midnight on the third day, Kenji gave a soft, involuntary sound and turned his laptop for Mara to see. The catalogue had resolved, not into text, not yet, but into structure, a 9-dimensional, error-correcting lattice of terrifying elegance, its redundancies nested within redundancies, its local repair rules generating larger geometric stability. Anton began swearing in Bulgarian without pause. Helena stood, sat, then stood again, all color gone from her face. "What?" Mara said. Helena pointed at the model, then at a whiteboard filled earlier with equations. "What Adrian built from the books," she said, "is isomorphic, no, richer than isomorphic, to the class of quantum codes people have proposed for space-time emergence. Not metaphorically, structurally. The same logic, redundancy yielding geometry, local correction preserving global continuity." Mara understood enough. Space-time not as fundamental substance, but as something arising from deeper informational relations. A universe held together not by raw continuity, but by repair. "The simulation claim," Anton whispered. He was right. Helena turned on him with old scientific fury. "No, he may have been right that reality is implemented through correction. That does not yet tell us what kind of implementation, by whom, or under what ontology. Do not become stupid now." But her voice shook, which meant the ground had already moved. The final layer appeared only when they added Harrow's last locked file from the safe, opened now with the key he had pressed into Mara's hand at the hospital. It contained Adrian's original note, the postal receipts, and one additional object no one had expected to matter: Harrow's own meticulous monthly ledgers of the Concordance's meetings. Not a 19th book, not a hidden substitute. something more exacting. The ledgers recorded order of discussion, who first identified which feature, where disagreements had arisen in cataloguing, which measurements had been corrected, when Noor overruled a paper identification, when Layla revised a hand, when Mara changed a collation after new evidence, when Helena rejected Anton's premature inference. Human judgment traces, error and correction inside the correcting system. Mara stared at them and felt, with a kind of stunned gratitude, how much Harrow had understood before any of them could prove it. 9 minds, not followers, she murmured. The code required independent but reconcilable observers, not just data, but documented disagreement resolved through method. Adrian had not wanted disciples because disciples converged too fast. He had designed a proof that only a community of specialists, correcting one another over time, could safely reconstruct. Solitary revelation in his scheme was mathematically insufficient. They worked until dawn. By then, Anton and Kenji had extracted from the lattice not merely a structural model, but predictive outputs. Small, testable consequences, local manifestations of correction logic under specific physical conditions. Helena selected the one least vulnerable to interpretive cheating, a synchronized nanosecond-scale drift across isolated clocks paired with a statistically anomalous suppression in random bit generators and muon detections under a precise configuration 3 hours hence. It was the sort of prediction no sane fraudster would choose because it was too fine to stage, too ugly to publicize, and too exact to forgive. The equipment came piecemeal from Helena's Institute contacts, the Cavendish and Noor's conservation lab, rubidium clocks, random number generators, a muon detector, nothing dramatic, nothing arcane, only the ordinary instruments of a civilization trying, in its halting way, to learn whether nature was seamless or assembled. At 4:13 in the morning, the observatory room held 9 people, 18 proofs in a strict sequence along the table, cables over the floor, monitors humming, Harrow's empty chair at the head. Rain moved lightly over the roof. No one spoke much. Exhaustion had refined them past rhetoric. Mara watched the second hand on her wristwatch move, aware of the absurdity of using one timepiece to witness another. The predicted window opened. For 18.4 seconds, 3 isolated clocks drifted backward, relative to reference by a pattern Anton had derived from the Romanian wormhole vector. The random generators, independent and shielded, showed a synchronized suppression unlikely enough to make Helena close her eyes before opening them again to check she had not become theatrical. The muon detector count dropped below expected background by a margin that on any other day would have sent them hunting for instrument error. Then the readings returned to ordinary behavior, as if the world had cleared its throat and resumed pretending it had no mechanism. No thunder, no lights, no occult revelation, only the terrible, respectable violence of data. Helena spoke first. The probability of joint occurrence under null assumptions is obscene. Anton let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter and almost like grief. Sister Inez crossed herself once, not as a concession to miracle, but, Mara thought, as a scholar acknowledging scale. Gabriel put both hands flat on the table as if steadying himself against physical motion. Noor wept without drama, wiping her face impatiently and continuing to log the readings. Mara stood very still. She had expected, if proof came, horror or triumph, or the jagged emptiness she had seen in Lewis when patterns became commandments. Instead, what she felt was a widening sadness and relief difficult to separate. Adrian had been right enough to force reality to answer. Harrow had spent his last years not chasing a delusion, but building a method worthy of a dangerous truth. And the world, the ordinary wet world beyond the boarded windows, had just betrayed that its continuity depended on correction. The last transformation from code to meaning belonged, fittingly, to Mara. It came not from mathematics, but from cataloging grammar. When Anton rendered the final semantic layer as symbol strings, everyone else tried first to read them as language. Machine language, alien language, compressed logic, anything but the thing Mara recognized almost at once from years of accession work. The structures resembled retention classes, provenance hierarchies, storage qualifiers. Not human library codes exactly, but the conceptual equivalent. They did not describe a program being run for entertainment or control. They described a record being kept. She asked for the outputs in ordered groups. She rearranged them according to the metadata dependencies Adrian had enforced. Then she saw it. Not sentence precisely. Classification, a preserved environment, sentient emergence, error tolerance, recovery priority, retention. It was in the vocabulary of whatever intelligence or process underlay the structure, not a toy world or a prison simulation. It was an archive copy. No one in the room moved when Mara explained it. The rain had stopped. Somewhere below, in the sleeping grounds outside, a fox barked and was silent. "Not a game," she said, hearing her own voice as if from across water. "Not even an experiment, not primarily. A preservation system. A conservation substrate. Reality isn't being performed for an audience, it's being retained." Helena stared at the output, then at Mara. "You're saying the simulation hypothesis is the wrong metaphor?" "Yes." Mara touched the ledger with one finger. "The right metaphor is library science." Gabriel made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh if laughter could break cleanly. Anton sat down very suddenly. Sister Inez closed her eyes. Noor, always the first to go toward the human consequence of a thing, said softly, "Then whoever built it, whatever built it, didn't make us as toys." "No," Mara said. "If this interpretation is right, we exist because something wanted us not to be lost." That was the ending none of them had prepared for. Not cosmic tyranny. Not a childish programmer in the sky, not a ladder out of the world, nor a command console hidden behind the page. Something stranger and, to Mara, infinitely more moving. Intelligence matured not into domination, but into preservation. The makers, if makers they were, remained alien in scale and kind, perhaps post-biological, perhaps descendants of minds rather than separate species, perhaps less like persons than processes. But their relation to the universe resembled the relation of the best conservators to damaged manuscripts. Stabilize, redundantly store, correct locally to preserve globally, hold against loss. The world was not fake. It was kept. Only then did Mara open Harrow's envelope. Inside were 3 sheets in his narrow, disciplined hand. He had written the letter after his hospital admission, knowing, as old men sometimes do, that the body had finally begun speaking with authority. He did not claim to know the final meaning. He distrusted anyone who claimed such things. But he did claim to have understood Adrian's ethics. "I did not hide the books from the world. Adrian did. My part was only delay. There are truths that improve us by arrival and truths that expose whatever is worst in us. I believed this one could do either. So I made a condition of its reading. Community, doubt, labor, and time." He wrote that he had chosen 9 minds because no solitary intelligence should carry a proof that might be mistaken for permission. He wrote that if Adrian was right, then reality itself depended on correction through relation, and any human understanding of that fact reached without relation would already have betrayed it. He wrote that publication would become the first temptation, and the wrong publication the first disaster. Then, in the last paragraph, Harrow did something Mara had never seen him do in life. He allowed himself tenderness. "If you have reached the end, then Adrian was less alone than he feared, and I was luckier in my collaborators than I deserved. Behave, therefore, as if you inhabit not a prank, but a preservation. Behave as if being retained imposes obligations. Behave above all like something worth preserving." The room remained silent after Mara finished reading. It was Anton who broke it. "We cannot bury this." No one answered immediately because all of them knew he was both right and wrong. Replicated. But if you attach to it the predictive framework in parts once replicated. But if you attach to it the claim that reality is a retention substrate, you will hand every cultist, every tyrant, every venture capitalist and state laboratory on Earth a theology with equations. "And if we don't," Anton said, exhausted fury roughening the edges of every word, "we become priests." "No," Gabriel said, "we become editors." Mara had expected the argument to last hours. It lasted 40 minutes, which in retrospect proved how much the years had made them one machine despite themselves. They agreed, not without cost, to publish the mathematics in fragments under ordinary academic pathways. New error-correcting codes, new predictions, new physical tests, distributed among specialties, so no single paper announced a metaphysic. The full catalogue and semantic inference would remain restricted among the Concordance and, eventually, whomever they judged able to inherit not just the result, but the method. Anton hated the decision and accepted it anyway. That more than his earlier betrayal made Mara trust him. By dawn, the 18 proofs were back in their boxes. Outside, the first ordinary buses of the day were beginning to cross the city. Students would soon hurry to lectures. Librarians would unlock reading rooms. Booksellers would sweep steps. The world, having admitted under measurement that it was corrected, resumed the appearance of something continuous and unmade. Mara stood at the window of the boarded observatory and looked out at the wet, pale grounds. Lewis came to her then, not as hallucination or omen, but as memory properly placed. He had wanted the world to contain code because he could not bear it to be indifferent. What had destroyed him was not appetite for pattern, but isolation from method, from correction, from other minds. Adrian had understood that too. Harrow had built against it. The Concordance itself had been the final instrument, 9 people preventing one another from becoming prophets. She turned back to the table, to the boxes, to the exhausted faces of the only people in the world who knew, with respectable evidence, that existence might best be understood as a conservation act. And to her own surprise, what she felt most strongly was gratitude. Not because someone or something had made them, because someone or something had refused to lose them. Epilogue. The first papers appeared 11 months later. Helena's name was on one, Anton's on another, Kenji's on a third. All were dry, technical, and apparently modest. All quietly altered the literature, a new family of codes, a new interpretation of boundary redundancy, a curious experimental anomaly reproduced, after enough resistance and embarrassment, by 2 labs with no reason to flatter anyone's metaphysics. No headlines announced the end of materialism or the proof of cosmic librarianship. Civilization retained its dignity, so did physics. The Concordance kept meeting on the last Monday of every month. The old observatory room acquired better lamps and a newer kettle. Harrow's chair remained at the head of the table, not as relic, but as reminder that rigor could outlive the body that insisted on it. Raphael healed crooked but functional. Anton became, if anything, slightly kinder. Gabriel sold 2 important books to fund a climate-controlled storage vault for the 18 proofs, and then pretended the sale had been purely strategic. Sister Inez published an essay on the visual history of notation and refused to tell anyone why it made her smile. Noor began training younger conservators in redundancy protocols with a fervor that seemed to Mara almost holy. Mara herself returned to the university library with the same key ring and half the same duties, but the work no longer felt like retreat from abstraction. Cataloguing had become, in the deepest sense, philosophy enacted under dust. To describe a thing accurately was to help it survive. Months after the revelation, on a grey afternoon in late autumn, she and Gabriel went into a second-hand shop in Cambridge to look for nothing in particular. That had become their shared luxury, entering ordinary shops with ordinary intentions, letting the world remain cluttered and underdescribed for an hour. The place smelled of rain, paper, and radiator paint. Students crouched in the fiction section. A child sat cross-legged on the floor reading a book about planets. Near the till stood a bin of damaged review copies no one had sorted yet. Mara picked up one at random and felt the familiar grain of cheap paper under her fingers. A used book. An ordinary object. Read, bent, priced, misshelved, handled, kept. Gabriel watched her with that old, almost smile of his. "You're doing it again." "What?" "Looking at everything as if it might be the last surviving instance of a civilization." Mara considered the child reading about planets, the proprietor totaling a sale, the rain marking the window in temporary diagonals. "Perhaps," she said, "that is now a reasonable way to look." He did smile then. When they stepped back into the street, the bells were striking the hour somewhere beyond the traffic and bicycles. Cambridge lay around them in its accustomed damp brilliance: stone, leaves, river, exhaust, old light. No seam showed, no interface. No celestial machinery revealed itself in the clouds. The world looked, as it always had, second-hand and miraculous. And for the first time in her life, Mara found those things compatible. She had once feared that if reality turned out to be coded, it would become cheap, a stage set, a trick. But Adrian, with his dead proofreader's patience, and Harrow, with his pitiless ethics, had delivered a better answer than terror. If the universe was indeed written through correction and preserved by an intelligence foreign to theirs, then its value was not diminished by artifice. Books were artifacts. So were cathedrals, sonatas, stitched sails, maps, translations, children's drawings pinned to refrigerators. Making had never cheapened a thing. Care had always increased it. At the corner, Gabriel turned toward the river and Mara toward the library. For a moment they stood in the weak afternoon, neither moving. Then Gabriel said, in the tone he reserved for truths too small to perform, "See you Monday." Mara nodded. She went on through the damp city with her satchel against her hip and Harrow's last sentence, by now inseparable from her own thinking, moving quietly through her like a second pulse. Behave as if you inhabit not a prank, but a preservation. So she did, and the world, annotated by weather and use and human error, seemed not less real for being kept, but more.
Hmm.